And then we will, but don't tell anyone that, okay? That's a secret. Make sure you don't tell anyone what we just said. Thank you. That's the way I like to start the recordings. So, Francis, thank you so much for joining us late in your day and for all the work that you've done on compiling all these studies. I'm going to let you introduce yourself, and it's all yours from now on until we stop.
Great.
And
Thank you.
hi to the
Hi.
typical Scottish greeting. Hi.
Hi. Yeah. Unfortunately. Also, you might be able to tell from my accent that I'm English for my sins, but I've lived in Scotland longer than I lived in England. I just have the English accent, but
I see.
Scotland is,
Yes.
yeah,
I'm
Scotland.
very clueless, so no, I couldn't tell.
Oh, honestly, you can go anywhere in the world, like really far-flung places, and people will say, "But you don't sound Scottish." So,
Oh, I
anyway,
thought you did. Okay, see,
oh,
this is the
great.
little I know.
But yeah, great to be here with you all. Thanks so much for having me. So yeah, I'm the one of the comms co-leads at the for the global team for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. So we're here to kind of support our members around the world and the different hubs, of which WEAll California is one. So David had invited me in today. To present some of the work I've been doing looking at American public opinion, how Americans think about the economy, and how we can help build support for a well-being economy or something similar. And I have a background in campaigning and strategic communications to kind of change, like win hearts and minds and change public narratives on issues like poverty and the environment and climate change. And I worked for the Scottish Hub before I joined the global team a couple of years ago. But yeah, without further ado, I'll just explain a little bit more about the work. We've been doing this. I've done a literature review. It's in draft form at the moment, but I will share it just with you today. If you could just refrain from sharing it externally because it's probably full of typos. It just needs a big edit. But we will publish it in the next couple of months. So really what I've been looking for is any testing that's been done, looking at different ways to talk about economic issues that will really help persuade people of the need for progressive economic transformation. So this is research not looking at very specific audiences, but what are some ways that would really be convincing if we did them at scale, repeatedly, that would really open up hearts and minds. Um, so today I've just got 15 minutes, so I'm just going to share three of the insights that came up, of which there are many, 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 many more, but you can check those out in your own time when I share the draft. And also, we've got tons of time for questions, and that just means you can kind of direct the conversation and we can dig into the parts that you might be most interested in. And the recommendations I'm sharing today are actually ones that we see across narrative change research. Even though they're the three I've picked out because I think they're the most important, but they have a lot in common with most narrative change exercises. So these are quite useful rules of thumb to think about any kind of progressive social change work that you're doing. And just forgive me if you have a background in strategic communications, narrative change, or framing. Many of these things won't necessarily be new to you, but yeah, I just want to make sure it's accessible and I'm covering the most important parts. And I'm sure you would find something in the literature review that would be kind of new and useful if these things are a bit entry level. So yeah, I'm just going to share my slides and check these are, yeah, are you seeing those okay?
Yes, we do.
Perfect. Thanks. Okay, great. So yeah, the three recommendations. So first is to really start with our values. Now, obviously, the work we do is fueled by these deeply held values, but we don't often make those explicit, and we kind of assume that when we're speaking and imagine that we'll be activating people's values automatically by talking about the issues we're talking about. So we just need to make that really explicit. When we activate values, we give people a reason to care. We all broadly, deep down, care about, everyone having enough, for example. But when we talk about these issues, economic issues, political issues, we're so kind of siloed in our ideologies and existing beliefs. We're often kind of sussing out when we hear a new message or hear from a new person, is this someone that's on my side, someone I agree with? And really rooting people in their values reminds them of what's important to them and helps establish common ground across different kind of political views or different backgrounds. And values that have been tested to be effective when talking about economic issues in the US include popular self-government, the idea that no one has a right to rule over others, solidarity, doing right by your neighbour, freedom from domination, particularly, and fairness. So, what this might look like in practice. So there's lots and lots of ways you can do this, but it's just to make this feel a bit more real so you can imagine yourself doing this in practice. So it can be before you get anything to else, just having quite an inclusive value statement. So something like, as a society, we believe no one has a natural right to rule over the others. Now that's something that whatever your political allegiance, you would find it hard to find someone that would disagree with that statement. So it establishes that common ground. But right now, the government lets corporations set the terms on which we live and work. Another example could be no matter what we look like or where we come from, we want our families to have the freedom to drink clean water, to breathe safe air, and to live in healthy communities. So that's taking the issue of environmentalism, which can be quite politicized and tied to people's identity, but grounding it in this popular value of freedom, which anybody can relate to. And again, it's quite a hard statement to argue with, that someone would say, actually, I don't think this person does have a right to drink clean water. Um, the second one, again, these feel quite self-evident, but I think we often overlook them, is the importance of explaining clearly our issue, rather than just asserting and just relying on people seeing things the same way as we do already. So yeah, they can feel very self-evident. If you're talking about things like unions, you think, well, shouldn't really need to explain that, or why we need like a minimum income floor or reparations. But it's really important to explain our case because when we talk about a problem without concretely explaining, how that problem came to be, who is doing what, to whom, how, and with what impact, people will make sense of the information you've given them. So if they don't already share your understanding of those issues, they'll just fill in the blanks with their existing beliefs. And I think an example of where this is really pertinent to economic systems change campaigners is thinking about talking about rigged systems. So one of the really interesting insights from some of the research was that Americans increasingly, Native Americans, do now think that the system is rigged in favor of the powerful, which is probably more typically would have been a progressive way of thinking about things. But people can easily agree that the system is rigged in favor of the powerful. They can agree up to that point and then have very different interpretations of who those powerful people are and who's rigging them. So we need to be really careful when we use the language of things being rigged in favor of the powerful without explaining who the powerful are, what they're doing. So, a rigged system for some people looks very different from the ideas that we would hold. I mean, this book is literally even called Rigged, how the media, big tech, and the Democrats seized our election. This idea of the liberal elite and multiculturalism being vilified with this kind of like the woke bashing. And it can really really feed into kind of anti-immigrant and racist rhetoric as well. Um, so yeah, how to avoid that is really just to explain your rigged system. So as a society, again, always starting with a value. So like a statement that we used before, and then to establish that kind of freedom from domination value, but then just explain. But right now, the government lets corporations set the terms on which we live and work. The powerful few rig the system by cutting taxes for people at the top, weakening labour unions, and letting employers avoid paying decent benefits. As wealth is concentrated in a few hands, there's even less of a check on the powerful. And then something like we need to make a big fundamental changes to society, and then explain your solution. Now, these are just examples. This could really look like whatever you want it to, but it's just showing what I mean when I say explain, the A to B to C, so no stone is left unturned. Um, and then thirdly, oh, sorry. I think I've just put things in the wrong order. And then thirdly, always name a solution. Um, so one of the biggest challenges we face as communicators and activists is actually people's sense of fatalism, that they maybe think, well, the system's rigged, it's always going to be that way, things are just getting worse, what can you really do? So it's really important to, instead of just feeding the existing doom, Americans are already very worried about the economy, and the cost of living and those kinds of things. Um, just try not to stay in the problem too long and remind people that the economy is a system that people designed so we can redesign it. Now, there hasn't actually been a piece of research in the US that really looks at the economy as a whole with lots of testing, from a kind of what's the ideal piece of research that we would want to see that we could just pick up and run with, which is why we just did a literature review of all various strands of looking at like tax, manufacturing, reparations, all these different issues to look at what the common threads were we could build some insights from. But this specific recommendation comes from pieces of research done in England, in the UK, and South Africa and Australia. And the general principle holds across cultures that explaining that something was something we created so that we can recreate it is just a powerful way of doing that. And then this bit is more specific to US research, is always name a feasible solution that matches the scale of the challenge. That can be particularly challenging when we talk about economic systems change. If we're like, oh, you can do it, just vote for this local legislation, or it might feel like, well, that's not really going to, unrig capitalism. So a way you can deal with that is either focusing on one area of the system and how that could be changed, or show how bigger reforms could unrig the whole system. So that could be something like we need to redesign our economy with measures like a maximum wage and a heavy wealth tax to do away with extreme wealth and the power that comes with it. Obviously, just insert your own kind of solutions and explanations here. There's just examples of what it could look like. So yeah, I've put this slightly in the wrong order, sorry. But going back as well to that point about explanation, another topic to be really careful about and be really, considered about how you talk about these two separate topics are poverty and systemic racism. And yeah, I should say trigger warning here if you don't want to have to think about the reality of the level of racism that exists in America today. I would just like go on mute for a couple of minutes and then that part will be over. But yes, I did find it really distressing to read the research, even though it's popular knowledge that racism is a huge problem. I think the scale of it was really quite extreme. So the research showed that if you want to talk about poverty as a problem to solve, the deep dehumanizing narrative that's like it permeated American culture that kind of pathologizes black culture means that when you talk about poverty, people are often associating that with Black people and equating that with choices like lifestyle choices, and it's really not opening them up to see how policies have led to that situation. So it can be much more helpful if you're trying to persuade people is to talk about what everyone should have and what everyone should have access to and what's fair. Talk about kind of the future you want to see and how things should be, rather than talking about poverty in itself, because talking about poverty quite narrows people's thinking and they tend to associate that with like individual blame, and it can really trigger people's existing racism. And then kind of separately but related, when we talk about systemic racism, it's so important that we are explaining how systemic racism works. So obviously as progressives, when we talk about racism, you wouldn't necessarily think it would need that much explaining, but for a lot of people, they are just seeing racism through the lens of direct discrimination rather than understanding policies like redlining or just like how generations of like, well, the legacy of slavery and then like generations of like discriminatory policies have led to today's outcomes. A lot of people aren't understanding that, and actually we probably don't spend enough time explaining those things so that people can understand what we're talking about, rather than if we just are calling things racist and like calling out the problem of racism without making those explanations, people will often move into a more defensive place where it's harder for them to be persuaded because they don't understand, they feel attacked, and they just see you as kind of other. So yeah, that's a really tricky one, and these are really, all of these are take them or leave them. They're kind of recommendations based on what works to kind of persuade the biggest number of people. But I realize there'll be times where you just want to call things out the way they are, and that's absolutely valid to do. So yeah, when you get into the literature review, you'll see there's a lot more on detail on how to talk about race and racism and build an inclusive we. So perhaps if we have time, depending on what people are interested in when we get into the questions, I could definitely speak to that for a few more minutes. But yeah, I think that's us at time. So yeah, as I said, we will publish the literature review in the next few months, and then from that we will um, make kind of more bite-sized resources available, because even with an edit, it's probably going to be over 60 pages, and not everyone's going to read that. And it means you can skip to the bits that are most interesting to you, like care work, manufacturing, reparations, whatever it is. Okay, thanks. So yeah, that's us.